More than a century after the sinking, there is still inside the Titanic the idea of a space the world never got back. No hand ever returned there. No opening was ever simple. And what truly unsettles us is not even what might be inside. It is the fact that maybe that door was left behind on the ship's worst night. Before we go deeper into that forgotten point inside the Titanic, like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what we are about to reconstruct here is not some easy myth. It is a real boundary of history. Down there, the Titanic does not look like just a sunken ship. It looks like a place time learned to consume slowly, without hurry, without witnesses. The bow still commands respect, but the interior no longer belongs to the logic of a living ship. The extreme cold preserved part of the structure, while the ocean silently corroded the rest. And in that contrast, the central question is born. If so much has already been seen, why do some areas remain out of reach? Maybe because what was lost in there was not just a room, but the very path that once led to it. To understand that, we have to go back to the night of April 14th to April 15th, 1912 and strip away the excess legend. The sea was calm. The cold cut through the skin. The lookout scanned the horizon with the naked eye, without binoculars. On the bridge, everything still seemed to follow the routine of a great ocean liner moving at speed. But all it took was one mistaken timing, 1 second too late, and that crossing would change forever. Have you ever noticed how some disasters begin in total silence? The Titanic began that way. No blast, no explosion, just a dark void growing ahead. The decisive impact was not a head-on collision. It was a long, submerged scrape along the side, enough to compromise the structure across a critical stretch of the forward section. From that moment on, the Atlantic did not come in like a spectacle. It came in like a calculation, like a technical threat, like the methodical invasion of compartment after compartment. Down below, the people working there felt it first through vibration, through strange noise, through the sudden rush of freezing water. And in that instant, the ship stopped being merely luxurious. It became a failing system, a massive body trying to remain upright while already beginning to sink from within. As the water advanced, the inside of the ship began to change function within minutes. Corridors stopped being passageways and became hazards. Doors that once organized the ship now divided safe zones from doomed ones. The crew had to decide quickly which sections still mattered and which were already lost. And this is where the video takes shape. A space does not need to be mysterious to become inaccessible. Sometimes it only needs to end up on the wrong side of chaos. What once felt routine becomes an obstacle. What once felt ordinary becomes the last frontier. And no one realizes the full weight of that in the moment. This room that haunts the Titanic imagination does not need to be treated like an invented legend. The strongest idea here is to picture an ordinary interior space, meant for service, storage, or technical routine, trapped behind narrow access points and low visibility sectors. A place with no glamour, no spotlight, no audience. And because of that, exactly the kind of place that could have been left just as it was when everything started falling apart. And honestly, Is it not more chilling to imagine an ordinary room frozen in the worst possible moment? Because that is where history really lands. Not an exaggeration, but in the brutal interruption of something utterly normal. At some point in that night, access stopped being a choice. The priority was no longer recording, understanding, or coming back later. It was containing, climbing, evacuating, buying minutes. Doors were shut, sections were cut off, and the water began deciding what was still reachable. What stands out most here is this: the loss of that space does not feel dramatic because someone wanted to hide it. It feels real because no one could afford to reach it anymore. And after that, the ocean took over the rest. It is hard to think about it this way, but some places do not disappear because they were concealed. They disappear because tragedy took over everything. As the lower levels gave way, the Titanic began sinking by the bow. That detail changes everything visually. The front goes down first. The interior responds to the new angle. Objects slide, routes shift. Areas already weakened vanish deeper into the ship. Outside, the size of the hull still inspires awe. Inside, though, the ship is already reorganizing itself around disaster. What had been a pathway becomes a trap. What had been a room becomes a lost point. And this is exactly where the film changes temperature. The tragedy stops being only external and starts crushing the ship's internal logic. Above, the struggle becomes survival. Lifeboats, ropes, sharp orders, people trying to grasp the size of the problem. And the contrast is brutal. While the deck holds all the human energy it possibly can, certain areas below have already fallen out of the action. They are no longer at the center of the tragedy. They are being left behind. It is a cruel thought, right? On the same ship where some fought to escape, other spaces were already being handed over to silence. And maybe that is why the image of that room carries so much weight. Not because it promises a secret, but because it carries the feeling of having been abandoned in the exact moment the world above was running to survive. When the structure reaches its limit, the Titanic breaks apart. The bow goes down first. The stern section is left exposed, and the ship stops existing as a single whole. Everything inside goes down with that rupture. It is not just iron tearing apart. Context breaks with it. Entire environments can no longer be read the way they once were, and any space that was already cut off now exists under a different logic. The logic of the seafloor, of darkness, of total inaccessibility. What was once part of a working ship becomes the remains of a drowned world, and that changes everything forever. After the sinking, another kind of silence begins. Not the silence of the night at sea, but the silence of a place no human presence returned to for decades. The Titanic reaches the bottom, scatters between impact and debris, and certain areas remain where they fell, sealed by the violence of the event itself. That is why this video does not treat the room like a cheap suspense trick. It matters because it represents a real limit. if this reconstruction is already pulling you deeper into the story, this is the moment to leave a like and stay with us. Because from here on out, the mystery grows, but the historical care grows with it, and that is what holds everything together. After the night of 1912, another story begins. Not the story of panic or evacuation, but the story of time at work without witnesses. Decade after decade, the Titanic remained at the bottom of the Atlantic under extreme cold, total darkness, and crushing pressure. Some parts held, others gave way little by little, as if the ship were being erased in slow motion. And even so, certain areas remained there untouched by any human hand, as if the ocean had decided to preserve their last possible state. The most unsettling thing is that this silence is not empty. It preserves, corrodes, conceals, and at the same time turns every absence into a question. In 1985, everything changes scale. The search for the wreck finally finds its answer, and the image of the bow appears as a genuine historical shock, the kind that needs no exaggeration. The ship had been there all along, but not in the form the popular imagination had preserved. It appeared as ruin, as evidence, as a monumental presence on the ocean floor. And at the same time, the discovery opened a new phase of questions. Because finding the Titanic did not come close to meaning we understood everything it still concealed. If anything, it was almost the opposite. The more we saw, the clearer it became that certain parts still lay beyond reach, as if the ship were still imposing its own rules. When expeditions begin approaching the interior areas, the feeling changes. It is no longer just awe. It is tension. Technology can light up corridors, staircases, openings, and torn sections of the structure. But the ship answers with very clear limits. Some passages are blocked, others barely exist anymore. And this is where the video reaches its strongest point. We can see close enough to want to enter, but not close enough to forget the risk of what could collapse. And then that uncomfortable question hits. How far does curiosity remain research, and at what point does it become interference? This is the heart of the story. Curiosity reaches the edge. The equipment reaches the edge. The light reaches the edge, but truly going inside would be something else entirely. It would not just mean observing. It could mean touching, shifting, breaking, contaminating the reading of that space. And honestly, this is where the weight of the Titanic changes in nature. The ship stops being only a submerged enigma and becomes a test of historical maturity. How far should we go just because it is now technically possible? In an age when everything seems to demand access, footage, and exposure, the Titanic can still impose a limit. And that says a lot about the ship, and about us. Over time, it becomes clear that there is a brutal difference between what is visible and what is accessible. Some sectors can be observed through openings created by the disaster itself or by later collapse. Others remain hidden behind crushed corridors, broken floors, sagging structures, and spaces that can no longer withstand any more aggressive approach. And that difference matters, because it keeps the Titanic from being treated like an open set. It is not. It still imposes boundaries. What we can see is not necessarily what we can reach. And that detail, technical as it may sound, becomes an incredibly powerful narrative key because it keeps the unknown exactly where it belongs, inside what still resists. The condition of the structure explains much of those boundaries. The metal is exhausted, the interior is unpredictable, and what looks solid in the beam of light may be one step away from falling apart. Broken flooring, ceilings hanging down, doors jammed by the deformation of the hull itself. Opening a passage in a place like that is not just a technical problem, it is a threat to the very trace that remains. Sometimes the act of revealing can become the act that erases, and that brings in a point many people ignore. Preservation is not always beautiful or satisfying. Sometimes preservation means accepting that you do not touch, and accepting that honestly is not always easy. And then the imagination begins to work. Not as fantasy, but as serious hypothesis. What may have remained in there? A duty ledger, a locked cabinet, a forgotten tool, an intact shelf, a small ordinary space that survived, frozen in the worst possible moment. The most striking thing is that there may be nothing grand in there at all, and that would make the weight even greater, because historical value is not in the spectacle. It is in what was interrupted, in what no one ever prepared to become memory. It is almost crazy to think about. Sometimes the thing that brings us closest to the past is not the extraordinary. It is precisely what was ordinary until it suddenly was not. The public often looks at the Titanic expecting a final revelation, a secret room, a last piece of proof, an image that settles everything once and for all. But serious archaeology moves at a different pace. It accepts gaps, works within limits, and knows not every question needs to be answered by force. A little frustrating? Maybe, but also far more honest. The Titanic remains fascinating precisely because it resists our rush to turn everything into access, image, and possession. And deep down, maybe that is what makes this room so powerful. It does not just feed mystery, it exposes our discomfort with what will never fully give itself up. In the end, this story touches something bigger than curiosity. The Titanic is not just a famous ruin, it is a maritime grave. Every object, every corridor, every mark of human presence down there carries the memory of a night when more than 1,000 lives were lost. And that changes everything. The question stops being only, what is in that room, and becomes, what right do we have to act upon it? That is where mystery meets respect, and where some doors begin to hold value precisely because they remain closed. Because not every discovery honors memory. Some only cross the wrong line. Today, technology can do far more than it could in the earliest expeditions. Better cameras, more precise sensors, more detailed mapping, finer distance control. But the central point has not changed. The more we can see, the clearer it becomes that certain boundaries are still there. And maybe that is exactly what makes this so uncomfortable. We now have the ability to get close enough to want to enter. But we also have enough evidence to understand why that step should not be forced. It sounds contradictory, I know. But that is where the maturity of this subject lives. Not every technical breakthrough calls for intrusion. Sometimes the real advance is knowing when to stop. Sometimes it is worth stepping back and looking at the Titanic from the outside again. The bow still carries an almost impossible presence, as if the ship insists on holding its shape after everything. The stern, on the other hand, feels like another story altogether. More brutal, more torn apart, more shattered by the violence of the end. That contrast helps remind us of something important. The Titanic is not just a collection of rooms and corridors. It is an entire landscape of loss, spread between preserved grandeur and irreversible destruction. And maybe that is why certain exterior shots work so well as a breath of air. They restore scale to the tragedy and show that the ship remains larger than any single room within it.
What you saw here was a historical reconstruction with AI, based on records from the time, told in a cinematic format.
At this point, that room stops being only an interior location and becomes a symbol. It starts representing a line. On one side, human curiosity, wanting to know, to see, to open, to confirm. On the other, historical responsibility, recognizing the moment when discovery itself begins to threaten what has survived. And let's be honest, this is the heaviest part of all. Because the problem is no longer lack of access. It is the moral and material cost of crossing that access. And when a space becomes the symbol of that conflict, it stops being just a lost room. It becomes a question about limits. While we debate whether it should be opened or not, the ocean keeps doing its work. The metal weakens, edges give way, the interior loses definition. What once seemed readable fades little by little. The Titanic is being erased at a slow but constant pace, and that creates another tension. Time itself may destroy certain answers before any human being ever reaches them. But even that does not settle the issue, because rushing to reveal can also speed up the loss. It is a hard dilemma, almost cruel. The historical clock is pressing, but an impulsive move could destroy the very thing that still remained to be understood. So the question comes back in another form. What might exist in there? Maybe ordinary objects. Maybe nothing visually grand. Maybe only an intact arrangement of simple things left in the wrong place at the wrong hour. But that is exactly what makes all of this so powerful. The unknown does not weaken that space. In a sense, it protects it, because the historical value of an environment like that is not only in its contents. It is in the fact that it remains preserved in context. And context is everything. An object removed can become a piece. An object left in place can remain a witness. That difference is enormous. In the final stretch, the video returns to what truly matters: the lost path, the corridor, the door, the dark line between what can still be observed and what may need to remain at peace. Have you noticed how some stories grow heavier when the answer never comes? That is exactly what happens here. The closer we get, the more the absence of an opening starts to sound not like frustration, but like a necessary choice. And that completely changes the meaning of the room. It stops being a prize for curiosity and becomes a physical reminder that history at times is also preserved through refusal, through restraint, through respect. The Titanic is still down there, silent, immense, and more fragile with every passing year. Parts of it have been seen, studied, and reconstructed in images. Other parts remain trapped in the dark, like this room that runs through the entire video without ever fully giving itself away. Maybe there is something important inside. Maybe there is only the weight of a routine interrupted. But after 113 years, the most honest question may not be, what is in there? It may be, would opening it still count as discovering it? Because some doors in history do not stay closed by accident. They stay closed out of respect. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable secret of all. Not every truth has to be dragged out of the dark to keep its value.